Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, we saw the Queen, and I felt like I was a guest at the Queen's castle in her house at Birkhall. The Queen was an excellent host, and the guests always had a good time. And we also found out how competitive the Queen was, and that those who were wise didn't win too often, feeling like if they did, they wouldn't be invited back. We saw that was the case with a certain duke that dared to have a recount, and he won, but he really lost when he was never invited back. So let's see what's going on today. In this chapter, we're seeing the Queen as the voyager in the years 1961 to 1967. Queen Elizabeth, in her 60s and beyond, became an avid traveler. It was for duty and pleasure. She was older, but she still had enthusiasm on her visits. She slowed down in her travel in her 70s. Her royal tours tended to be shorter because of the ease and faster air travel. Her pattern changed. No more trips to the subtropical Africa. She made one more tour to New Zealand and Australia, but otherwise, she was staying within the Commonwealth. She traveled mostly to Canada. Her contribution to diplomatic relations at home and abroad was still valued. She made two unusual and diplomatically significant trips to Tunisia and Iran, as well as briefer trips within Europe. In the spring of 1961, she went on board the Britannia to Tunisia. It was instigated by the Foreign Office as a demonstration of British goodwill. No member of the royal family had previously visited the country, which had gained its independence from France in 1956. The President, Habib Bourguiba, was seen as an important vice of moderation in Africa. He gave compliments on Britain's handling of decolonization. To return the compliment, the Foreign Office suggested that a visit by the Queen Mother would do much to confirm our regard for Bourguiba and our interest in Tunisia. She would be great to have there because it appeared that Tunisian, especially the women, already regarded her with interest and affection. The royal yacht set off in good weather down the English Channel. Among those on board was Brigadier Bernard Ferguson, and the Queen invited him because he knew Tunisia well and was a fluent French speaker. They were all eating too much. Queen Elizabeth said, "I forgot to bring my skipping rope. I shall have to do this instead." Then she went gliding off across the sun deck, doing mock eurythmics, throwing up her hands in the air at every hop. She was so obviously enjoying herself madly. And they stopped in the British dependent territory of Gibraltar, where the crowds were almost delirious. Even Spaniards joined in with enthusiasm, which they had not been allowed to do during an earlier visit by the Queen and Prince Philip. When Britannia set sail again, the weather in the Mediterranean deteriorated, and as they approached Tunisia, so did the situation in Algeria, where a rebellion broke out among the French troops stationed there. There were fears Tunisia might be drawn into a conflict, and Queen Elizabeth sent word to President Bourguiba offering to postpone her visit. The answer was none. Before landing, she prepared meticulously for her speech in French in honor of Monsieur le Président, although she said that it didn't matter a hoot what she said, as no one ever listened. They arrived at Tunis April 24th with a gale blowing and the sun shining. The banquet that night wasn't easy. The president was tired and worried about Algeria. Tunisian officials altered the seating plan, and at the last moment, even Queen Elizabeth could not make the conversation flow. Ferguson said she did her speech quite charmingly, smiling at the president with every sentence. Dinner served with fruit juices included Birkhall and a deep-fried pancake containing an egg. Back on board, Queen Elizabeth called for champagne, and they all dissected the evening. She described how her brick had exploded and covered her chin with egg. The next day, after various engagements, Queen Elizabeth gave the president a return banquet aboard Britannia. This time it was a more enjoyable occasion than the night before. The British ambassador, Anthony Lambert, called it a masterpiece because of the Queen Elizabeth's warm and gracious personality. The Belgian ambassador whispered to Lambert, "I feel I'm in a dream. So does everyone else." The effect on the president was the most marked. He seemed to relax and tell Queen Elizabeth his entire story. The Queen then visited a women's organization, a founding hospital, and an Islamic museum in Tunis, and at Medjez El Bab she saw the Commonwealth War Cemetery. To the ambassador's alarm, she was driven through the narrow streets of Kairouan, where religious feeling ran very high, and was shown the great mosque. She visited Sousse and Monastir, the president's birthplace. At the reception for 250 people, which she gave aboard Britannia, British embassy staff worked like a team of well-trained collies. She spoke to at least 100 of them. All in all, the ambassador declared the visit a brilliant success for Anglo-Tunisian relations and one more personal triumph for Her Majesty. In June that year, Queen Elizabeth was obligated to cancel several engagements after breaking a bone in her foot. She wrote to D'Arcy Osborne, "Because one cannot get a shoe on, and therefore I cannot hop around hospital wards, shipyards, universities, garden parties, picture galleries, boys' schools, girls' schools, race meetings, agricultural shows, civic centers, slum appearance clearances, horse shows, regimental reviews, and all my usual treats." Queen Elizabeth also tried to combine business with pleasure because she liked to enjoy herself. She went to Northern Ireland in April 1962. She had other engagements, but she went to the 350th anniversary celebrations of the town in Enniskillen, visited her regiment, the 9th and the 12th Royal Lancers, at Lissanelli Camp, and opened the new Department of Physics at Queen's University. And there was a special bonus of a racing victory. At Downpatrick Racecourse, she watched her horse, Laffy, win the major race in front of an enthusiastic and record crowd. This trip was followed at the end of the month by a cruise in Britannia to Cornwall, where she visited a flower show and had tea with a young farmers' club and Truro. In Devon, she opened the Tamar Bridge and spent a day island hopping by helicopter in the Scillies before sailing back to Portsmouth. In June of 1962, she went on her first visit to Canada since 1954. The main purpose was to celebrate the centenary of the Black Watch, Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, of which she was Colonel-in-Chief. The regiment was based at Montreal, but at the request of the Canadian government, she agreed to balance her stay there with a visit to Toronto, the home of her other regiment, the Toronto Scottish, and the famous Woodbine Racecourse. That set the pattern for several more Canadian visits, and care was taken to include both regiments and both English and French-speaking areas. And there was a second reason for the visit. The Canadian government wanted to establish the memos of the royal family that could come to Canada for limited trips in the same way as they visited different parts of Britain. And this visit was kept as low-key and easy for her as possible. Even still, she still had a full program. In Montreal, this included 6 Black Watch engagements, a garden party, and several civic events. One day's engagements filled 15 hours. The next 4 days were spent in Ottawa, where the Queen Mother was a guest of the Governor-General, Major General George Vanier, and carried out another dozen engagements. For her Toronto visit, Queen Elizabeth stayed at Betterwood House in Port Hope with Vincent Massey, who had been Governor-General at the time of her 1954 visit. Her last day, Sunday, June 16th, started with a hot drive into Toronto for a civic reception where the guard honor provided by the Toronto Scottish Regiment fired a royal salute, and it was so loud it smashed windows. After an official lunch, she was able to escape to one of her favorite places, a race course. At the Woodbine track, she watched one of Canada's premier races, the Queen's Plate Stakes. And that night, she flew home with eloquent thanks to the Governor-General, who wrote that the Canadians will never forget the grim war years when a gracious queen stood strong and steadfast beside a noble and gallant king. She endeared herself to them again, and Your Majesty has a great part to play for the crown throughout the Commonwealth. That was certainly her hope. Her next Commonwealth tour was not for another 3 years. Meanwhile, there were more short trips in Britannia and the British Isles, and she sailed to the Channel Islands for 4 days in May 1963, and her first visit since she had been there with the king in 1945. The trip was almost disrupted by gale-force winds. Despite the wind, Queen Elizabeth and the Dame of Stark, Sybil Hathaway, who had stoutly resisted the German occupation. Despite the wind, the two women drove around the island in the dame's open carriage. No cars were allowed on Sark. She flew on to Jersey in weather so bad, her lady-in-waiting Jean Racken recorded that the spectators were appalled. Britannia was forced to take refuge in a sheltered bay. Even so, the heavy swell made it difficult for Queen Elizabeth to get aboard from the royal barge, and dinner at Government House had to be cancelled. On the last day, she toured Alderney with strong winds and choppy seas. In October, she flew to Northern Ireland, where she opened the War Memorial Building in Belfast and was given a standing ovation at a civic luncheon. In cold and windy weather, at the Abercorn Barracks at Ballykinlar, the next day, the 1st Battalion, 3rd Royal Anglican Regiment, of which she was Colonel-in-Chief, paraded for her, and she presented medals. A trip to the Maze racecourse had been included in her program that afternoon, but visibility wasn't great, and it was almost impossible to see the horses. And the day ended unhappily with a charity film premiere, which, according to the Queen Mother's Lady-in-Waiting, was a very bad film. It was Rampage, starring Robert Mitchum and Jack Hawkins. In 1964, the Queen Mother had agreed to make a tour of several weeks to Australia and New Zealand, and she had been invited to open the 3rd Adelaide Festival of Arts, which she was patron. Visits to other states and to New Zealand were built around that. It was all arranged, and then, Sunday, February the 2nd, she felt sick and was admitted to the King Edward VII Hospital. It was unexpected. In her younger years, she had been sickly with frequent attacks of flu or tonsillitis, and she rarely admitted to being ill in her later years. She hated taking her temperature. She thought that a tiny homeopathic tablet or powder could cure her of any complaint. Her Scottish childhood had taught her that nothing was better than open windows in the bedroom or a stiff walk in the wind to blow the germs away. But it was more serious this time. She had to have an emergency appendectomy, and she had the surgery February the 4th. Martin Gilead immediately sent telegrams around the world to cancel the tour. She got sackfuls of letters, and a lot of flowers arrived at the hospital, and within a few days she was being visited by members of the family and then her friends. Prince Philip wrote to say how happy and relieved I am that everything has come out so well. Prince Charles, writing from Gordonstown, told her that after he had his appendix removed in 1962, he made the mistake of watching Eric Sykes and had a jock on television. It literally nearly split my sides laughing. My goodness, it was agony. I wish I could come and visit you like you visited me, but as I'm at this horrible place, it's impossible. And she returned home to Clarence House February the 16th. So I'm going to end the video here. In this episode, I felt exhausted once more by the Queen and all her travels, which spanned the years of 1961 to 1967. The Queen was everywhere, and she enjoyed her travels, and so did the crowd she visited with. She would turn business into pleasure, too, by seeing horse races at places she went to. The weather may have been bad at times, but it didn't stop the Queen from fulfilling her duties. And she's been quite inspiring, and we'll continue on with the book, The Queen Mother, in our next video. We're getting closer to the end of the book, and I have to say, it's been a pleasure to learn all about this wonderful lady, her childhood beginnings, her reluctance to marry, and her happiness when she did. And she discovered once she became queen, she loved her duties in being a queen, and provided her husband the support he needed to do the duties that he had to do. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it will help me in the YouTube algorithms and get more people to the channel if they like the royal family as much as you and I do. So I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.